Welcome back to yet another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. Today we have an extremely special guest, Dr. Ron Sundstrom. He is the professor of philosophy at the University of San Francisco. He is a member of USF's African American Studies program, and he teaches the university's Honors College. He is the humanities advisor for the SF Urban Film Festival. His research focuses on the philosophy of race and the related areas of racism, xenophobia, and mixed race identity, political philosophy, and urban policy, and figures in African American political theory, especially Frederick Douglass. I'm really excited for this conversation today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for the invitation to be on this podcast, Gautam. And it's a pleasure to meet you and to talk to you today about ideas.
Yeah.
I love talking about ideas, so let's do it.
Any philosopher would say talking about ideas is a great thing to do.
It is.
So, you were saying something interesting before we started recording, and I actually wanted to touch on that. I think it's a phenomenal point, and it's something that's really interesting, which is this idea that when you look a certain way or you sound a certain way, there's a certain narrative that people may assume that you're going to hold. And I think that's a great place to start, because in understanding that, you can understand what people's expectations of you. And often that can underlie many power and social structures. And so one question that I had for you is, what do you think are some of those themes and topics that perhaps people assume that you're going to hold, especially when we're talking about these particular fields?
Right. Well, by when people, do the eye test and we look at someone and we place them in a category immediately, a category that's often socially, if not often, but always socially informed, um, male or female or some other gender category. We look at their skin color and their general appearance, and we try to put them especially in the United States, in a race or ethnicity box, maybe a nationality box. We look at their comportment and what they're wearing, and we start making other kinds of race, ethnicity, and class assumptions about them. We ascribe, right, identities on them because we understand the world vis-a-vis these identities, these categories. It's shorthand for, Ron's this kind of person or Gotham's this kind of person, and this is how I should approach them. And so we make quick, right, off the cuff judgments about them to ease social interaction, right? It's a normal thing to do. I see someone in a firefighter's outfit, I'm going to assume that they're a firefighter. I see someone with an apron on in a store, at a restaurant. I'm going to assume, perhaps wrongly, that they're an employee of the store. That's a good one there. Being assumed that you're a worker rather than a customer is a problem that loads of people have experienced, right, because of their presentations. And sometimes we're off. So it's always good to be humble, especially as we age and we figure out how often we get someone wrong. We need to be humble. Philosophers have a way of making basic ideas like humility more complicated, Gautam. So I'll go ahead and say the more complicated thing. We need to be more epistemically humble, right? To not make loads of assumptions about people, to use stereotypes, especially in interactions that have some importance. Whether it's at the cafe and I'm talking to the barista ordering my cortado, or in the classroom talking to my students. I shouldn't make quick off the cuff assumptions about their politics, their way of life, their values, their religious outlook. It's just, it's dangerous territory because one just doesn't know.
Yeah. I mean, I think this idea of ascribing an identity to ease social interaction is like a really important point. One of our guests in previous episodes used that point to kind of differentiate racialization versus like racism. The
Mhm.
And I'm curious to understand what your understanding of perhaps the difference between those two are. Because there is, and we've talked about this previously on this season, the importance of one understanding the differences based on culture, race, ethnicity, and then using that to then better understand the world and how to navigate different spaces. But at the same time, you want to make sure that those beliefs are aligned with what is real to some extent,
Mhm.
some definition of real, where it's like you're not, I think far off from what is likely to happen. And so how do you differentiate? And this is something that I've always had difficulty with between racialization versus racism.
Right. In my early view, there was no difference between uh, racialized identities and race, right? So we would, or ascriptions in race. My early view, the subject of my first publications, were about how we understand race as a social category. And this is many people now, especially those who have any interest and familiarity with the academic debates around race, gender, or sex, have heard of, right, has heard of social construction. So I was a classic social constructionist early on in my career. I argued that social identities like race um, didn't have much, if any, biological material or reality to them. I mean, I would have back then in '98, I would have definitely said, yeah, of course, there's some ancestral connections to places. But what we mean by race and ethnicity in the United States are political constructions that have nothing to do with those, if you will, genetic, have very little to do, rather, with those genetic markers. We can be very light, but yet light and look like a member of another category, but yet be placed in right a category like Black or Latino or Hispanic or Asian because of ancestry, because of people's understanding of it. So I didn't think at the time that there was much of a different differentiation between what Anthony Appiah famously called racialized identities and race. So for me, a race, as I argued in a paper, one of my more popular papers, race is a social category. It's a social category from the top to the bottom. So one's Black or Asian or white because of the existence of the label and the way that people assume that members belong to that label. You belong to that label because if you have certain properties or markers, your skin color, your hair texture, your family origin, and then the laws come in and social practice come in and reinforce that label. And in another important part, if you will, if you think of this, for example, in terms of directionality, if the
Hmm.
label coming down on you is from the top, the laws, policies, and social practices are coming from the sides. And often, in
Mm.
response to those laws, policies, and social practices, individuals will uptake the label. They'll accept the label, and they start calling themselves after that label. And they're responding to the presence of the label, of the identification, right, of the act of social ascription, um, and uh, and they are responding to the effects of those social ascriptions in their life.
Mm.
Those social ascriptions are present, and they have massive effects, some positive, some negative, right, depending on the category and depending on the place and the time in our nation, right? You know, it, these categories can lead to your being segregated from housing or from school if we're talking uh, before the Fair Housing Act. It can lead to your being not segregated or subjected to racial violence or being discriminated against, or just invited to the party or not invited to the party. So there's a lot of power behind these categories. So I thought of them as entirely social, Gautam,
Hmm.
in the beginning of my career. I've changed though over time. I've changed over time. Um, insofar as insofar as right, I've become more wary of these categories, more wary about how important they are and their function in us, in our lives. I've come to see them as more, to use a word that another philosopher and peer uses, right? Lionel McPherson, in his work. I think of these categories as unruly. They're unruly categories. They do not always play by our, if you will, the rules set down by the US Census category or by the rules that I've inherited from my social practices. Young people come around and apply them in new ways, or different regions of the country will apply them in new ways. So we're not sure sometimes, right, how race works. And because there's so many weird, edge cases and overlaps and exceptions. It's an unruly category. What do we mean by it? Do we mean one's ancestry? Do we mean one's skin color? Do we mean one's, right, mere family ancestry? And if we think of mere family ancestry, can you be adopted into it? So these categories are strange, right? These categories are strange. They're unruly. There's a lot of conceptual confusion around them. We're confused about what the meaning of the concept
Hmm.
is. And that's the direction I've gone in. I'm not someone who thinks that they should be gotten rid of entirely because they're still socially useful
Hmm.
and loads of people use them.
Hmm.
The people who think that, who are dubious about the future of race, they call themselves eliminativists. But I have, Gautam, grown more suspicious of these categories, and sometimes even
Hmm.
to the point of, if you will, indifference,
Hmm.
where I don't really care about, there are moments in my life where I don't really care about the idea of race itself, though I can affirm, right, our attachment to them and attachment to the people they name. But I'm worried about the words we use to name these races and the meanings around those words, right? So I'm
Hmm.
skeptical. So I become more and more convinced of people who think that words like black, white, Asian function in our society to point out, right, the ancestry and not necessarily particular bits of ancestry, like, oh, you're from Nigeria, or you're from Bangladesh, or you're from the Philippines, or you're from Guam, right? Not that so much, but race corresponds to uh, big assumptions about, right, white, that's European, right? These continental assumptions. Again, here I'm drawing on loads of people's work. In particular, I've enjoyed my recent conversations with Lionel McPherson. And I think that Lionel's arguments here are starting to work their magic on me. That race refers to these assumptions in early American thought about continents. So if
Hmm.
you're Asian, that means you have Asian continental ancestry. Or if you're black, that means you have African continental ancestry. And so
Hmm.
when people are using race, like black or Asian or white, they're often referring to this idea that such people originate from such continents. But of
Hmm.
course, that leads to all kinds of weird confusions as well, right?
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
I'm still a work in progress on these ideas.
Yeah.
I'm trying to be humble and but also questioning. So sometimes, again, like I said, my I tend to be growing indifferent to these categories as having a lot of meaning outside of the purposes that we put them to.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for kind of breaking that down because I think one thing that's been very clear throughout this season is how complex race is. And I think
Mm,
as we move forward and kind of dive into each one of these themes, I think it becomes clear how much more there is than just what's at the surface. And
Mm,
so one of the things that I've been most fascinated about, and I'm really curious to hear your experiences and opinions with this, is often when we talk about race and the difficulties that come along with it, particularly in the American context, I think people end short of actually thinking about what a world would look like where racism, for example, didn't play a role in our
mm,
day-to-day lives,
mm,
in whatever context. And I
mm,
think it's really difficult to imagine that. And that's kind of where I've been thinking about what does it look like to imagine a place like that? Because I think what I've noticed across different cultures is
mm,
that all that changes is the group that's being labeled as the minority. Whether it
mm,
was originally the Irish and then the Catholics, I
mm,
mean, it's just changed over time, but there has always been a group or a multiplicity of groups that have been placed at the bottom. And so what it seems like is as we eradicate one form of discrimination, another form of discrimination just takes its place.
mm,
And it seems that the reason for that is so long as there's some concept of a majority and a minority, there seems to
mm,
be some power distribution where people in the majority will always try to retain their power while people in the minority will always strive to gain more power. And this seems to be a consistent cycle that has existed throughout so much of history. And so what
mm,
I'm trying to understand is when we try to talk about, eradicating one of these issues of class or of race or of gender,
mm,
I'm curious if all we're doing is replacing it or whether we're actually moving towards a world where there's less of it, less of
mm,
these types of discrimination. So what are your thoughts
mm.
on that?
Yeah. Well, uh, as you know, I work on xenophobia, and I think that there's something built into our species, right? Built into our experience as humans, where we're going to be suspicious, right? We're going to be suspicious about um, things that are unusual or things that are strange to us. So, being afraid of the other, of that's literally right what xenophobia means, being afraid of the other, um, is uh, a I want to be careful, but it seems to me pretty natural. It seems to me pretty instinctual. Not that that's a good thing, but to know that that's often the case, that it's happening, and we should be on guard for that and be suspicious of it. Now, so I think that there's some perhaps psychological stuff going on with human beings and the fear of the unknown and of difference. Definitely. And I'm not affirming that. So there's that. That's part of your question. But the other part of your question is about the constant, if you will, of repeating the same problem. We get rid of a category or the importance of a category, and then we create new ones to do the job of the old ones, right? That was
Yes.
your question. Yeah, I think that traces back to our right attempt to organize the world as human beings and our our instinct or inclination to be afraid of the things that are unknown, or being afraid of the dark, being afraid of terra incognita, right? To go, look, I want I want to be careful about the stuff that I don't know about, so I'm going to be skeptical and afraid of it. And that can lead to really disastrous consequences when we move from that initial suspicion and fear to exclusion and the quick move to, well, they're different, so they must be my enemy and they must be a threat, right? We are failing to exhibit the virtue of hospitality and openness, right, to people who we deem as the other, who we deem as foreign. I think that's very dangerous. It's a moral failing on us. I don't think if you're asking me, Gautam, if you're asking me whether I think we can attain a utopia where we no longer do that, I'm going to be skeptical. I think there's something about us, right, that doesn't like the dark, right?
Mm, the
That doesn't
unknown.
like the unknown,
Yeah.
you know,
And
that
I
was afraid of people of people we're not familiar with. this
Yeah.
baseline stranger danger, right? Instinct in us.
Yeah. And I think, one thing that I've learned with traveling, which is
Mhm.
to openly travel and let the world come to you, you have to actively try to let go of as many of your fears that you've built up over your life as possible. So there have
Mhm.
been so many, and the thing is, I can think of, times where I was teaching in the Himalayas where I was
Mhm.
really afraid of walking through the streets at night because I was like, I don't know what animals exist here. I don't, I
Right.
didn't know, but there were times where I had to. And I would say that what it requires for us to move towards a world where I think differences are more seen rather than like ter people are terrified of is kind of this like spiritual journey where our relationship with the unknown itself changes. And I think it is only through that does that then permeate into changing our views on racism or our views of different cultures, xenophobia and in a much larger scale than just simply putting our focus on solving one form of fear of the other, whether if we
Right.
just focus on race or we just focus on ethnicity. I think it has to be something that's far more personal to us in how we relate to the stranger. Because, something
Mhm.
I think about often, and I've been meeting a lot of people recently. I think there's two forms of American dreams. I think there's one where it's, you become the behemoth of a large multinational corporation. And there's that American dream. But there's also the other American dream of going and living in a mountain alone where nobody really bothers you and it's you and your
Yeah.
family and your dog.
Right.
And that narrative itself, I think, is really interesting, where a lot of people, desire to be left alone from everybody else.
Yes.
When that's like a goal that you even strive for, or is a narrative that your country values, that in itself shapes how people will view others, right? Like I think
Right.
it's really interesting that belief of being isolated is something that is actually desired in this country, and I've always been fascinated by how that became to be the
Mhm.
case.
Yeah. Right. Well, you know, people have talked there's a lot of ink spilled about the ideal of the cowboy and
Mm,
and the ever or hitting the road, right? The ever westward movement of us Americans, right? Um, and that part of the American dream, right? There's a lot there out there on that. So I think that that's an important feature of us as well. But maybe, and we over idealize it. I think a big part of it's also like we're joiners. We like to be in company with other people. We like, right, our communities. We get comfort from them. In fact, I think we need them deeply. So cutting against if you will, this cowboy ideal, though, or not just cutting against it, but sitting hand in hand with this cowboy ideal in us. The person who's going to go out and get on their horse and ride, right? Little
mm.
Nas X style,
Hmm.
and get out of town. Or goes hand in hand with the fact that most of us, right, are deeply dependent, and deeply desire being in community,
Mm,
because that community gives us a great deal of meaning with each
mm,
other. But back to your question about, right, approaching the stranger. I think you're right that there's a basic value of, like I used the word hospitality before, an openness, a willingness to be compassionate, to be empathetic to the other. That's a fundamental part, right, of living together and developing as
mm,
individuals and as a society. Being
mm,
open, having an open mind and an open heart to others, not being a sucker, not being a mark, but being open to others and being willing to encounter them for what they are, and learn from them and appreciate them. That's a deeply moral value, one that I affirm, right? That recognizes the fundamental dignity of others, right? Not just in the abstract sense. Everyone is a human person, right? Everyone's a human person because they're made in the image of God, perhaps, though I like that idea. I work on Frederick Douglass, and I see that idea in Frederick Douglass as well, right? and it's a powerful one. But also there's the formal, if you will, theological answer. Everyone's a child of God. Everyone's a little divine. And then there's the formal, if you political, philosophical one, or moral one. Everyone's a rational agent.
Mm,
Everyone is as a person because of their membership in our species, because of their emotional capacity, because of their rational capacity, and we need to respect that. But I think beyond that, right? We respect each other, not just because we're meat, you know, or not just because we're thinking meat, but because of these intimate facts about our lives, you know, the petting of a dog, the
mm,
playing with a cat, the having a meal with friends, with others, the sharing of food and intimacies, the being together with other people, the magic of those little moments, right? That are embedded in our lives, embedded and embodied in our lives. That's the part. When I think about the dignity of human beings, I understand the formal bits, right? That person has dignity because they're thinking meat, or because they're right, or because their God created meat. Um, but there's something else. They're not just meat. They're human beings doing human stuff, having human experiences. And in those little moments, cooking breakfast, having a cup of tea or coffee and sharing intimacies. I think those are some of the most beautiful aspects of our existence. And in there, I see signs of dignity. So you're talking about
mm.
traveling,
Well said.
and
Yeah.
you can see that in Amsterdam, you can see that in Manila, you can see it in the streets of Stockholm. You can see these little bits of human beauty at play. And it's
Mm,
a healthy life to go and see that beauty expressed in different contexts, in different people. And if you can't get to Stockholm, you can go to Kansas.
yeah.
You can go to Texas. You can go to Wisconsin. You can hit Oklahoma, and you can see the beauty there. In this, get out of yourself, sit down, breathe, and watch people, right? Not the irritating stuff. Don't focus on that, because you'll see that. But in those little intimate moments, and you'll see
Mm.
beauty expressed. And that's the thing to focus on and to keep aware of. There goes a person, and and I should exhibit respect towards them.
It's the ability to relate to another when on
Yeah.
the outside they can be doing different things. I mean,
Yes.
whether it's the religion that you follow, the dresses that you wear,
Right.
the way you talk, it seems
Mhm.
that fundamentally though and I think that's the beauty of philosophy. It
Yeah.
seems that it like kind of it addresses that, we are all different, but it starts to get to these deeper and deeper
Yeah.
questions that every single person on this planet thinks about.
They
Why do we
do.
suffer? What happens when
Right.
we die? These
Right.
questions, it does not matter what language you speak, what type of dancing you do, what food it just doesn't matter. Because
Right.
it's like I think that that's one of the most beautiful parts of philosophy. It makes you realize how connected you are not only to all the people that are alive now, but to all the people that have ever been alive. No matter
I
how
like
much
that.
technologically we've advanced in all these things, people 10,000 years ago were also thinking about the same questions. Like
Yes.
what is our place in the universe? We may have learned more, but we still have
Right.
that exact same question. And so I think that is one of the most beautiful parts of philosophy, which is you realize how interconnected humans are on such a deep level, and humanity is.
Yes. Yes. And the philosophers have tried to capture this in different ways, whether it's Plato in the Socratic dialogue of the Euthyphro, right? Engaging in conversation with the young man Euthyphro about what Euthyphro has done, right? He was prosecuting his father, but that's another longer story. And whether or not Euthyphro understood the charges he was making, and the ideals that were leading to the charge. What is piety? It's a beautiful story, not just
Mm,
about the definition or the failure in that dialogue to find a definition, which points to a deeper, more transcendent truth. Or we have, Aristotle's version of, right, human dignity in our seeking, right, in our seeking of purpose and our desire, right, and our need and desire to be in community, to be with friends, to be with good friends, to be with useful friends, to be with fun friends, right, and to develop in a virtuous direction, to function well as a thinking human being, or to jump millennia, or in John Stuart Mill, and understanding, right, the finer pleasures in life and being able to discriminate between the things that I don't like, or the things that don't make me as happy, and the things that do, and the things that really excite my human capacities, especially to reason, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or the lesson I get from, Friedrich Nietzsche, the bits of me that says yes to life, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or Kant, which I was alluding to earlier, in the idea of dignity being centered in our rational capacity as human beings. But to put a finer point on this, Gautam, and to circle back to your opening question about the meaning of race to me, right? I understand, right, the connections between dignity and these categories, and their desire to be dignified in the categories, right?
Mm-hmm.
You should be able to be Asian or white or black, or, right, any other of the American census categories, which some of which are not, in fact, races or racial, right? Hispanic, Latino, what is that? That's not a racial category. That's a pan-ethnic category, right?
Mm.
And Asian. Well, if you want to be if you want to pay attention to ancestry and to genetic facts, whether or not Asian itself names a whole race, right? People from South Asia all the way
To
to the
Russia.
Philippines. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Well, you're getting kind of dicey. So that's got some pan-ethnic, action going on there, right? I understand the desire to hold the dignity in those categories and to understand them as social facts in our life. That's what my early work was about. I understand the history and the importance of those categories for present people. But I think it's important to remind ourselves always that the core, that behind those categories are individuals, and individuals
Mm.
are dignified. So one of my favorite, right, now I can cite, as I can allude to other philosophers, right, over and over
Mm-hmm.
again, but one of my favorite, right, sources here is Frederick Douglass, which also connects to a big stream in my work. And I think Frederick Douglass, got it right, over and over again when he talked about, right, humanity and dignity and the race idea, right? He was quite skeptical about race. He wasn't skeptical about being a Black American and about needing to fight for the rights of Black Americans, right? He wasn't indifferent, to use my original word, about him being Black. He wasn't indifferent to that at all, or the rights of Black Americans, or the rights of any Americans. He wasn't indifferent to that, but he wasn't indifferent about the idea of race. He was skeptical and worried about it, right? I said, right, I am growing indifferent towards it, thinking, yeah, it's there, but I'm wondering whether, its place in my life and other people's life is as important as they say it is. I am, right, I'm not arguing that it doesn't exist. I'm certainly not doing that, or that doesn't have social presence and effect. It certainly does, but I'm indifferent about the work we put it towards, the racecraft. So if you indulge me for a moment, there's a bit of Douglass's essay called Our Composite Nationality from 1869, where he gets at a point that I think comes closest to my view here. And that essay and that speech, that's an essay and speech, Our Composite Nationality. What he's doing, he's arguing for the right of Asian migrants to the United States in
And when was this?
1869.
1869.
1869, right? He's arguing for the right of the Chinese to come to the United States, among other Asian groups. And there he's referring, and in it, he refers to other immigrants. And in it, he says these wonderful words, right? Man is man the world over. This fact is affirmed and admitted in any effort to deny it. The sentiments we exhibit, whether love or hate, confidence or fear, respect or contempt, will always imply a like humanity. A smile or a tear has no nationality. Joy and sorrow speak alike in all nations, and they, above all, the confusion of tongues, proclaim the brotherhood of man. It's that core message, that core political, you can call it liberal if you like, right? Or just it's a core message, right? It's got its theological and quite ecumenical undertones, but it recognizes the intimate dignity that I was referring to before, right?
A smile or tear has no nation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's not just our reason, it's our sentiments, in those little intimate moments in our lives, being with our friends, our family, playing with our children, right? Greeting our parents, spending time with our friends. Those are beautiful moments of magic. And no American census category
can capture that.
Can capture that. I'm sorry.
And I want to add
Yeah.
something here because, recording the next episode, which is closing off the season, which I'm really excited to record, is with a friend, and we're actually going to just share, our experiences being racialized people. I think it's something I don't think too often about of what was my experience being Indian in the US. I try to kind of push that somewhere into a deep recess, and I'm like, I'm not even going to address that until far later. But
Yes.
I had forgotten because I feel like the type of people I'm around nowadays are people who love people. It has nothing
Yes.
to do with their skin tone. Just they love people. But I was working with a student yesterday, and he had said something that was, interesting, slightly problematic, but just interesting. And it touches on what you were saying here, where he was referring to people from, he was speaking about technological advancements, and he brought up, people who were living in poor countries, and the way he kind of like brushed them off as just like it's just like meant to be. It was just, like they're just poor.
Sure.
It happens that way. Felt very dehumanizing in that moment. And I
Yeah.
had to sit with that, and I was like, what was that feeling, right? What did I
Yeah.
feel when he said that? Because I
Yeah.
think even though this concept of a smile or a tear has no nation is simple, it is
Right.
actually such a deeply profound thing to embody. Once that concept exists in all of your beliefs, it changes a person dramatically because
Yeah.
the way they would talk about somebody from Venezuela or the way they would talk about someone from India or Nigeria, it changes. They no longer talk about them like some other who are just lesser than or
Yeah.
not worthy of because they don't have the same levels of money or resources or whatever
Mhm.
it may be. But they are like, oh, fundamentally, we are all still human. And I think
Yes.
sometimes I forget that not everyone holds that view. And it's only
Yes.
when you're on the other side of feeling that where you're like, oh, this person doesn't view me as a full human. Do you
Mhm.
actually feel the brunt of that?
Yes.
And
Right.
that's a really scary feeling. When you
It
feel
is.
dehumanized, that's a very
Yes.
scary feeling.
Right. And that's one of the destructive aspects about the history of race, whether we start that countdown in in Spain,
Mm-hmm.
in the 1400s, right? Or later on in Europe, or at our European attempts to understand and explain and to justify uh, 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 slavery, Absolutely. It's destructive. We write people off as, again, let me refer to Douglas, right? When refer in his wonderful autobiography, the second one, My Bondage and My Freedom.
Mm,
In that one, he says, right, I am enslaved, right? Slavery is not based, it's the crime, not the color, right? Slavery is about, right, the crime, it's the crime of slavery, not my color. My only problem is, according to Douglas, right, as he says, is that I was born a black man in the United States, right? So it's that, you know, slavery is not about color. It's about the crime
mm,
that behind it. And we use color to justify, right,
mm,
the slavery, So this
mm,
leads others to see in race fundamentally, right? Fundamentally, racist aspects built into it. Others argue that no, we can separate racial categories and use them in non-racist ways. But the legacy of these categories and the uses we put to them, are part of them, have been put
mm,
to them. I think humans are pretty creative. And even
mm,
though we've come up with words like, right, black and Asian to categorize, or white to categorize and privilege, and to dehumanize groups of people, we can use them in new ways, just like the kids can with all kinds of different words. Like, oh,
mm,
you're using that word in a new way. Didn't know. Didn't know. You could use, you could use the words in new ways like that. That's interesting. Like
mm.
the kids confuse me all the time about what the heck they mean by racism. I'm like, oh, that's
Mhm.
included now. Okay, that's not what I thought. So, and other such things. So, yeah, you know, I do
Yeah,
think that we can put these words, these ideas to new purposes, but the history lingers.
yeah.
Yeah,
And will for a long time because I
right.
think and I guess that's kind of the difficult part to sometimes like
Yeah.
really sit with. I think even when I think about how we were taught about slavery and just I mean not just slavery, but the philosophy of what we are talking about here, which we actually funnily enough barely talked about growing up, right? Where like slavery
Hmm.
happened, but we didn't talk about why it happened. Like, what are
Hmm.
the thoughts and beliefs that lead something like that to happen? It's not just that, oh, like they weren't that civilized back then, it
Hmm.
happened, and then they figured out that they were doing the bad thing, and then they stopped doing it. It's not that, like, I feel like that's kind of how it was presented. But there
Yeah.
was this ongoing changing of like what do we believe is good or bad, and it's not necessarily clear that we're moving into some like better direction. It's just clear that it's changed and it's
Sure.
constantly evolving, and that
Right.
there must be tons of things that we're doing today that we're like, yes, this seems right, but 1,000 years
Hmm.
from now they're probably going to look at us like we were doing something insane.
Sure.
and
There's
and
always
it
that possibility.
and I do think in a lot of senses that this like changing morality is really important to also identify because then we can understand how those same beliefs may also reappear today. It's not
Hmm.
that the things that caused slavery are of the past and they're done. It's that those same ideologies can like, kind of trickle into our lives in ways that we may not even be aware of, and then just manifest in different ways that may not necessarily look like slavery. But
Sure.
and I think that when you start looking at racism like that, I think I hate how racism in the US is spoken about like a binary where you either
Sure.
you say someone is a racist or someone's not a racist. I think
Right.
the idea concept of racism falls flat on its face from that moment itself. Without
Right.
understand, for me, I always feel like every person embodies certain philosophies of racism within their own belief system.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's a spectrum of people who may view the world more through a racial lens, and there are people who
Right.
view it far less. And
Yes.
oftentimes, so much of that is just exposure. I mean,
Hmm.
I've worked with people who've never left their small village. And so like
Hmm.
they don't all they've ever seen about other
Right.
people is simply the news. And
Right.
unless the news is favorable to you, it's very difficult that you're going to be coming across equal amounts of positive content. And it's not even
Sure.
equal. It has to be far greater than the amount of negative content. And so, but I wouldn't consider those people racist necessarily.
Right.
You know, I
No, I,
mean, it's
I agree. No, I agree. I think it's, of course, we understand, like in recent history, dating perhaps with ex-President Trump's, election, and then the murder of George Floyd and the reaction to that murder, the rise of a very dogmatic conception of racism, right? Um, Best exemplified by the work of Ibram Kendi. Either you're a racist or you're not, right? Either you're against race or you're a racist or you're an anti-racist. It's it's a strict binary with very little gray in between. And I do think that that's actually quite unhelpful, and superficial. We could chat for a couple more hours about definitions of racism and the way that philosophers have parsed them out in terms of, are these things is racism just a result of beliefs? Are they a result of attitudes? Ill will, as one famous philosopher put it, right? Or is racism an ideology, generally, you know? And then what do we do about these these cognitive behavioral aspects of us, like implicit bias? How does that fit in, right?
exactly.
We could again,
Yes.
we can work out these different definitions and see how they interact with each other, right? And then parse out what is individual racism, and is that as important and is that as important as, say, structural racism, and how do they interact with each other? And then and what the heck is this thing that, right, people are calling systemic racism? Is that some third thing, or is that just another way of talking about structural racism?
Mm.
That sort of thing. And it's a worthy conversation to have, to look at the wide scope of the different positions out there in the racism debate. But in short, right, back to your villager example, right? Being humble, again, I like the idea of approaching things with some epistemic humility here, not acting as if I know everything from the get-go, or assuming the frames I bring are the right ones, right? That person with very little exposure to the outside world can repeat a belief that they picked up from the television or the radio, and
Mm.
that belief or idea, we might say, independently, right, of their attitudes. Well, that's just a racist idea, if they say, for example, purple people are inferior, and we can say, independent of their intentions, well, that's just a racist belief. But as to the person being racist, you know, I would be much more cautious. I'd say, yeah, they're engaged in what another philosopher, someone who I count as someone who I admire, Larry Blum, argues. Well, maybe actually in such cases, that's an example of racial ignorance. You know,
Mm.
they don't know. Would a 5-year-old, a 6 or 7-year-old child who repeats a racial epithet because they heard they heard an adult say it, or they picked it up from some media source, and then they start saying the word like they would a curse word, you know? Is that child racist for saying that word? No, they just don't know any better. That's an example of, right, of a child, right, being ignorant about that word or that idea. And we can hopefully, right, address that in the development of the child, you know,
Yeah. And
being flexible and not, immediately, right, condemning a person or groups of people because they engage in thoughts that we see as morally troubling.
yeah.
I would like to, directly call out those ideas and say, though, those are bad, but consider the reasons, but consider the situation of that individual before I drop a ton of moral judgment down on them.
And I would say when the conversation is had in this way is when
Hmm.
the most profound changes occur.
Sure.
I've talked a lot about just my experiences in undergrad and how, we took a bunch of courses on how to like decolonize the
Yeah.
mind and this and that. And I
Right.
feel like they were really ineffective. And then I
Right.
took a few philosophy courses that addressed the same issues, but kind of opened up the nuance and complexity of the same thing. And all of
Right.
a sudden I felt that all the things that the original class aimed to do, once the kind of the conversation was opened up, I felt that all of those changes actually occurred, but they just weren't
Hmm.
kind of shoved, kind of shoved down your throat. And
Hmm.
it was yeah, but I think there's so many important things to discuss here because I think it's unfortunate how taboo so many of these topics have become. I mean, I'm really excited to get into all of these taboo topics. I'm excited to kind of get into and really discuss
Hmm.
because I don't think when I think about when I was at school, I don't think we ever sat down and had a really profound, meaningful discussion about race. But
Hmm.
what it means to be American or live in the US is you have to contend with race all the time. And it's
Right.
a very important part of everyone's journey of being American. It's what does it mean to be this color? What does it mean to look like
Sure.
this? What does it mean to
Right.
talk like this, dress like this? And
Sure.
and to what extent do I want to integrate into whatever this is
Sure.
called American
Sure.
society? And so, I wanted to ask you this question about integration because
Yes.
I think it's a really important question. And it's something I've always had to deal with, and I still do, right? I mean, there are a lot of practices that my family and my culture practice that it's hard to kind of be able to continue that while also integrating into the society enough to be like well liked and fit
Hmm.
into the culture here.
Sure.
And so when we think about integration,
Hmm.
what does that word first mean? And
Right.
is it possible to integrate into another society or a civilization without losing your quote unquote identity?
Yeah. That's a that's a very good question, and relates to my recent work. My I just, as you know, published a book called Just Shelter: Gentrification, Integration, Race, and Reconstruction. Right. And so you're asking me about the meaning of integration. There's been loads of different definitions of it, right? Starting from, let's say, and then I want to address integration and then the question of assimilation, step by step. Okay. So, for example, King would say of integration that it's not just desegregation, right? Desegregation is where we say, oh, we open up a neighborhood or a school to a group of people. But rather it's a change in the moral attitude of individuals towards each other, right? This attempt to this moment where we recognize someone else's personhood and their humanity, right? And we welcome them into, as he would say in other pieces, right, the beloved community. That's a really demanding vision of integration, not
Hmm.
one that I think we can accomplish because it's a bit utopic. We're not going to get there entirely. And then there are other more formal, right, more formal visions of integration. Perhaps it's a school or a neighborhood where you get, if we're just, let's say we're talking about three groups of people, blacks, whites, and Asians. Um, we're going to get an even Steven split between the groups inside of that institution or that neighborhood, right? So when I look at the neighborhood, I'm seeing a checkerboard, you know, I'm seeing a checkerboard.
Hmm.
But that seems to be to not really capture the idea as well. And we certainly don't always, we can't force that. And when we try to force it, it doesn't necessarily work, right? Because
Hmm.
not everyone wants to live next to each other for some bad
Hmm.
reasons, but also some decent reasons, right? We think not every instance that we might call segregation is segregation. It might be just separation and voluntary clustering, right? I
Hmm.
like the fact, I love, for example, right, going to Chinatown or going to Little Saigon and getting a bowl of pho, you
Mm.
know? And those communities like the Castro in San Francisco are examples of clustering, of group clustering, you know? So
Yeah.
not every moment, not every place has got to look like a checkerboard. And
Mm.
it's hard to pull off, and we certainly don't want to be all right. To be, I was about to say totalitarian and start forcing people to live,
Yeah.
or authoritarian and forcing people to live next to each other, to fit our preconceived notion of integration. This is a problem, by the way, with some American programs around integration, not because of their of not because of opening up a neighborhood per se, but because of targeting, right? In particular, poor, marginalized. I'm talking about very poor and marginalized
Mm.
communities of color, Blacks, Latinos, and saying, well, if you want resources, you're going to have to move, right?
Mm.
Right. We're going to have to move towards greater opportunity. So that hasn't worked out so well. Then there's
Yeah.
also a kind of integration that is right. That is, so if we have integration as, as mobility, where we try to force the mobility, or we have integration as a checkerboard, some sort of demographic pattern, they're not going to work. Now,
Mm.
my vision of integration, the one that I argue for in the book, is a bit formal. And if you don't mind, right, indulge me once again, and I will read you my definition, right?
Of
On
course.
page you don't need my page number, but is in my chapter on reconstructing integration of my book. Let's see here. This is you know chapter 6 of the book. I write, the inadequacies of past integration frameworks and policies should be acknowledged, but call it what you will, the idea of integration directs our attention to a valuable ideal. Integration is not the bogus ideal of cities whose neighborhoods look like a demographic checkerboard or a chocolate chip cookie. It's not an urban version of Edward Hicks' painting of the peaceable kingdom. Instead, it is a social and political value that signals democratic communication and open communities and opportunities. Integration as openness with is consistent in a pluralist society with a wide range of forms of social organization, including group dispersion and clustering. It is compatible with individual and group preferences to stay put, insofar as the requirement of open communities tempers that right. The United States, and I would hazard any pluralist liberal democracy, ought not to quit the idea. Integration, right, is a valuable idea. In the United States, however, it needs a bit of reconstruction.
Yeah.
So for me,
Definitely.
integration, at base is about opportunity and is about openness of our institutions to greater inclusion and to greater diversity, right? And I mean that in the widest way, right? For example, at a university, that would include not just racial and ethnic diversity, but also diversity of viewpoint and of perspectives, right? I do not
Mm.
want to assume that the person from the village you were referring to, Gautam, has particular forms of view, right?
Mm.
And I
Mm-hmm.
think, well, I got that person, so I got the view. No, that would be a mistake. I have no idea what they're going to
Mm.
think, and I need a wide variety of perspectives. But as for, right, whether integration requires assimilation, that's a loaded question, and it's quite controversial because as Americans, we've come to not like so much the idea of the melting pot, of integration, of assimilation, sorry. And we've come up with other words, like the psychologists like the word acculturation, where
Mm.
groups like the ones you're referring to, right, learn, right, pick up the bits of the dominant cultures around them, you know, the economic practices, the educational practices, the sort of mores for how you go about in the world, but they retain other parts. I think that's wonderful, and it's um, part of the wonderful dynamic of American society. That's great. But, at the heart of your question, I want to push back a little bit, right? At the heart of your question, what does it mean to lose is this concern about losing one's identity? Well, what does that mean? It
Yeah.
assumes that there's something original, primal, essential, right there to begin
Mm-hmm.
with.
Mm-hmm.
I have a set of practices I come in the door with that I've inherited from my family, from my religious institutions, from my community. But as I grow and live and encounter other people, those practices and habits and maybe even outlooks change. So then there's things that I'll keep, right? Food ways, art ways, dance ways, loads of the wonderful things that unite us with our, if you will, our ancestral origins or our
Mm.
family origins, you know, these little things. But as we meet new people and have new friends, these things are going to change, and I'd like to leave it up to that person from the village. What parts of their life, that they're going to change. Of course, they've got to, get along with everybody else. They've got to, if you will, right, follow the laws and engage in they got to follow the laws and engage in, the communal expectations that we have living together in cities or in nations. you know, one drives on the right-hand side of the road,
Yeah.
not the left-hand side of the road, kind of thing.
Yeah.
You're going to have to, that
You
sort of
give
thing.
up
That's going
some
to have to,
things. Yeah.
you have to give up some stuff. Right, exactly. You can't
Yeah.
expect everyone around you in your neighborhoods to believe the way that you believe, unless you find one of those special little clusters or enclaves where you can isolate yourself. If that's your bag, if that's your jam, great, go for it.
The
But
university.
but yeah, that's right. That's good and bad. But the kids, I teach loads of students. I teach loads of students who are second generation, or some first generation students. And one of their common concerns is, you know, the question you asked me, how do I adapt to this new world? And how do I get my parents to understand my, you know, adaptions, right? My adaptations, the way that I want to live my life. Because I quite like some of the things they do here. Maybe I don't like some of the other things, but I do like the idea. I do like the idea of some of the ideas that I'm encountering at the university or on the streets, or in the media, or I'm encountering with other people. So I hope that we would leave and would like to leave lots of room for people to retain, their cultural and religious practices as they see fit and not expect people to shed them for some monoculture, right? I would like people to be able to resist insofar as they see fit the the demands of our economy to join a mono economic culture, that involves all of us. I would like them to be able to, to stay a conservative Catholic if that's their thing, or a traditional Amish person, just to use some examples. Great, great, you know, but they and their kids should also have the right, to exit,
Mm.
to tap into to that cowboy you and I were talking about,
Mm-hmm.
to do a little Nas X. I'm going to get on my horse and I'm going to ride. Right? I'm going to get on my horse
Yeah.
and I'm going to ride. Mom and pops are not going to like that, but that's what we've done.
Yeah.
And that's part of the opportunity and the wonder and the beauty of this place as well.
Hmm.
And we need to be able to do that together responsibly.
Hmm. Wow. I took a whole beautiful page of notes and just in what you were saying there. I mean, I think this idea, I mean, even when I asked that question, I knew in the back of my head, I was like, okay, but like when I use the word identity first, what does that even mean? Because I think it's a really important question to ask before we talk about, what
Yeah,
does it mean to lose your identity? You got to first, kind of talk about what
yeah.
is identity. And there's so much that you said there that I wanted to kind of touch back on, which is you asked this question of how do I adapt to a new world, right?
Mhm.
By picking and choosing from what you've seen and what
Yes,
you grew up with from what you see in the new world that works. And that process of transition is a really beautiful process. And everyone does it generationally, but oftentimes not everyone does it culturally as well, right? I mean, I think we all have to naturally do that from learning what works for our parents when they grew up versus what works for us in today's day and age. And then to add the extra layers of culturally and then for some people racially. I mean, there's so many
yeah,
different elements to that for social class.
yeah.
Um, and I kind of to like pin this entire conversation back, I feel like it's something that we said in the beginning, which kind of underlies all of this, which is what is our relationship to strangers? How do we feel
Mm.
about people that we don't know? Whether
Yeah.
they look different, in all the different ways that they can be different. And it's something that I have to, really reflect on sometimes. When I come across somebody I really don't like, how do I respond? Because how I respond there says a lot about me. When somebody
Yes.
acts a way that I don't like, or speaks a way that I don't like, or says things that makes me feel unsafe, or how do
Right.
I respond? And I
Yeah.
think when my initial response to people that are different than me, even in ways that I don't like, is with anger or is with the
Yes.
desire to cancel or with
Yes.
then I'm like, then I am no different. It just all that changed is that I happen to believe that I'm on the right side of things. But
Sure.
if I wasn't,
Like,
then
how
I would
dare
have,
you ask me where I'm from
yeah,
or what I am, right?
like I would
Yeah,
have,
that kind of thing.
I would have been doing the same thing then.
Yeah.
I happened. So I
Right.
think when you talked about empathy and
Yeah.
understanding that, what it comes down to which is dignity again, and this is something I've
Mm.
always thought about myself, and I'm just curious what you think as well, of like what it means for me to be proud in my skin. What it
Mm.
requires to do that is a lot of self-confidence and a
Yes.
lot of ability to defend yourself, whether it's
Yes.
physically, financially, or
Right.
mental, so that no
Right.
one can simply just overstep you. And it's
Right.
to be able to stand up for yourself in that way requires a lot. You have to be in many ways intellectually capable, you have to be physically capable so that you can offer the space of empathy and the possibility for someone to come into your life without having, when you're like afraid of the whole world, then there's no space for any of these relationships. You will be fearful. And I have
Yeah.
found that most of the times the fear of other people of different races often just comes from a fear of the stranger. They're not really
Yes.
that different from each other. And often when I see very racist people, I just find them to be very fearful people. They're not, it's not just that they're fearful by race, they're fearful of just people. And so one thing I realized is like to deal with that fear of people though takes a lot of self-work. And it's not just I mean, part of it is philosophical and ideological, and a lot of it is also how do you feel about yourself? Do you feel like you're strong enough if you met a stranger and they were to like overstep your boundaries? Could you hold your boundaries? Right. I mean, there's so many, I think, things that come into play there that I think about all the time of like how much of my fear of people is just my lack of ability to protect myself. And
Mm.
because of that, because it's so low, I feel that at any moment anyone can overstep my boundaries. Therefore, I'm afraid of
Sure.
way more people. So
Yes.
I think this particular reason is a big reason I think a lot of people are afraid of others because they just feel like, the other is like
Sure.
bigger, stronger, whatever. And
Right.
so working on, loving the stranger more, I think can easily be done. But it has to be like a holistic kind of approach to how do you talk to a stranger. It's not just like these people are racist and these people aren't. I mean, I think
Mm.
I'm quite saddened with how that's where the
Yeah.
kind of the discourse has come now, because I just think it misses the point completely. Because all that happens is people are really good at now covering up how they present themselves. They say the right words, they say the right things, but who they, how they really act on a day-to-day basis is still aligned with the types of ways people would have acted 100 years ago, Like,
Right.
I would be upset if my kids married them. They still hold the same beliefs, but they just don't externally or outwardly show it anymore, which I don't know which you talked about earlier. What does it mean to be racist? And I think, these things matter. Is it just action? Is it intention? Is it thoughts? Yeah.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for all your insight today. I really appreciate it. This conversation was really important to have, and so I really appreciate your time.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure to have this conversation with you, to engage in the kind of practice that will help us, right, get in touch with other people, to engage in deep listening and hearing the other person, right? And I think that that's exactly what we need to do to address some of the concerns that you brought up there right at the end, right? Encountering other people in an open spirit, being willing to listen and to hear on with both parties. Thank you.
And that brings us to the end of our conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you again for listening and making this process so much more enjoyable. If you haven't had the chance to already, make sure to subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Google, and Apple Podcasts to get the latest updates on new episodes. If you've been learning useful information here, feel free to leave a review as well. A little bit goes a long way in spreading this podcast. And have a wonderful day. And as per usual, stay re-educated.